The morning arrived without ceremony. Smoke still rose from the shattered railway depot where American artillery had torn through German supply lines 3 days earlier. In a converted monastery on the edge of town, beneath vaulted ceilings blackened by soot, Dr. Heinrich Böhler stood at a wooden table, sorting through what remained of his medical supplies. Glass vials, cotton bandages stained brown with reuse, a leather case containing 6 morphine ampules, his entire reserve for 200 wounded men. Outside, the rumble of American tanks grew louder. Böhler's hands did not shake. He had been a surgeon for the Wehrmacht since 1941, had operated in field hospitals from the steppes of Russia to the bocage of Normandy. He knew the sound of defeat. It arrived not with thunder, but with the metallic squeal of treads on cobblestone and the strange, almost casual voices of American soldiers calling to one another in a language he barely understood. By noon, the monastery was in American hands. By evening, Dr. Heinrich Böhler would witness something that would shatter every assumption he held about medicine, warfare, and the industrial capacity of the nation he had been trained to despise. For 4 years, German military doctrine had emphasized endurance through scarcity. The Reich's physicians had been taught to see medicine as a finite resource, to be rationed with the cold precision of a quartermaster distributing ammunition. In the medical schools of Berlin and Munich, young doctors learned that sulfa drugs were precious, that morphine was to be reserved for only the most severe cases, that infection was an inevitable companion to war. They learned to accept loss. They learned to choose. Dr. Böhler had made those choices 1,000 times. In the field hospitals behind the Oder River, he had turned away men with infected wounds, knowing that the precious few grams of sulfanilamide he possessed could not save them all. He had watched gangrene spread through the limbs of teenage soldiers, had performed amputations with saws sterilized only by fire, had grown accustomed to the smell of rotting flesh that hung in every Wehrmacht medical station like an invisible fog. This was the reality of total war, or so he believed. This was the price of modern conflict. Germany fought with what it had, stretched every resource until it snapped, and when supplies ran dry, German discipline filled the gap. The Americans, he had been told, were soft, dependent on material wealth, incapable of the sacrifice that defined the German soldier. He believed this until the afternoon an American medical officer walked into his makeshift surgery carrying a wooden crate. The officer's name was Captain Robert Keller, a sandy-haired physician from Wisconsin who spoke with the flat, unhurried cadence of the American Midwest. He set the crate on the table beside Böhler's meager supplies and opened it without ceremony. Inside, packed in neat rows like artillery shells, were glass vials filled with yellow powder. "Penicillin," Keller said, as though the word required no explanation. "We're setting up a proper aid station. Figured you could use some." Böhler stared at the crate. He counted 30 vials. 30. In his entire tenure with the Wehrmacht, he'd seen penicillin exactly twice. Small amounts captured from Allied supply dumps, distributed to high-ranking officers wounded in the field. It was a miracle drug, whispered about in medical journals before the war. A substance that could halt bacterial infection in ways sulfa drugs never could. But it was rare. Impossibly rare. The Reich's pharmaceutical industry had never managed to produce it in meaningful quantities. British and American propaganda claimed they manufactured it by the ton, but Bowler had dismissed this as wartime exaggeration. Now he stood before enough penicillin to treat every patient in his care, offered as casually as a gift of bread. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his English halting but functional. Keller looked at him with mild confusion. "From supply. We've got crates of it." "Why?" The transformation of medicine from art to industry had begun long before the war. But it was the war that revealed the terrifying efficiency of American mass production. In 1941, when the United States entered the conflict, the nation's entire penicillin supply could fit in a single laboratory refrigerator. By 1943, American pharmaceutical companies were producing 21 billion units per month. By 1945, that number had grown to 650 billion units monthly, enough to treat every wounded Allied soldier and still have surplus to spare. The Germans knew of penicillin's existence. Their scientists had read Alexander Fleming's 1929 paper describing the antibiotic properties of the mold Penicillium notatum. They understood its potential, but understanding and manufacturing were separated by an ocean of industrial capacity that the Reich simply did not possess. German chemists, brilliant and methodical, struggled to cultivate the mold in sufficient quantities. They lacked the fermentation tanks, the sterile facilities, the vast networks of pharmaceutical production that allowed American companies like Pfizer and Merck to transform a laboratory curiosity into a weapon of war. In Germany, medicine remained artisanal. In America, it became assembly line abundance. Dr. Bowler had spent the war learning to work with scarcity. Now, as he watched American medics unload crate after crate of supplies, penicillin, morphine, sulfa powder, plasma, bandages still wrapped in sterile paper, he began to understand that he had not been fighting a war against soldiers. He had been fighting a war against a factory, and the factory had won. The American Field Hospital appeared overnight, assembled with the mechanical efficiency of men who had performed this task 100 times before. Canvas tents rose in neat rows. Generators hummed to life, powering surgical lamps that turned night into day. A portable X-ray machine arrived on a truck, carried by 2 men as though it weighed nothing. Bowler watched, silent, as his monastery surgery, his carefully organized domain of scarcity, was transformed into something he barely recognized. A wounded came in waves. German soldiers, their uniforms filthy and torn, carried on American stretchers. Young men with shrapnel wounds, broken bones, infections that had festered for days without treatment. In the old world, Bowler's world, many of them would have died, not from the severity of their injuries, but from the absence of medicine, from the arithmetic of rationing that placed some lives above others. But here, in this strange new world of American abundance, every man received treatment. Every wound was cleaned, every infection addressed. The American medics moved with a practiced rhythm that suggested they had never known shortage. They did not count vials. They did not weigh options. They simply treated as though medicine itself was as limitless as air. Captain Keller worked beside Bowler, demonstrating the proper dosage of penicillin for various infections. "We give it every 3 to 4 hours for severe cases," he explained, injecting the yellow solution into the arm of a German private whose leg wound had begun to show the telltale signs of gas gangrene. "Typically see improvement within 24 hours. If we'd gotten to him sooner, we could have saved the leg, but as it is, we'll need to amputate below the knee." Bowler nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. In the Wehrmacht, gas gangrene was a death sentence. The infection spread too quickly, consumed tissue faster than any surgeon could cut. He had seen men die in agony, their bodies consumed from within, because the medicines that might have saved them existed only in theory or in enemy hands. This boy, this private, who could not have been more than 19, would lose his leg, but he would live. The penicillin would halt the infection, prevent sepsis, give his body time to heal. It was routine for the Americans. For Bowler, it was miraculous. The symbolic weight of that yellow powder became impossible to ignore. Each vial represented more than medicine. It represented capacity, foresight. A nation that could produce antibiotics in such quantities that they became mundane, unremarkable, issued with the same casual efficiency as rifle ammunition. In the evenings, when the surgical work slowed, Bowler found himself in conversation with the American medical staff. They were younger than he expected, many of them barely out of medical school when the war began. They spoke of their training, intensive courses condensed into months, programs designed to produce field surgeons at industrial scale. They mentioned universities he had never heard of, pharmaceutical laboratories the size of factories, government programs that funneled billions of dollars into medical research. One night, a young American lieutenant named Patterson showed Bowler a photograph from Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper. The image showed workers at a Pfizer plant in Brooklyn, tending to massive fermentation tanks. It stretched toward a warehouse ceiling. The caption read, "Penicillin production exceeds all targets." "My uncle works there," Patterson said, pointing at the photograph. "Says they run 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. The whole place smells like mold, but they're churning out enough medicine to supply every hospital in Europe." Bowler studied the image. The tanks were larger than anything he had seen in German pharmaceutical facilities. The workers wore clean, white coats, operated in spaces that looked more like chemical refineries than medical laboratories. This was not improvisation. This was not emergency measure. This was systematic, planned, executed with the kind of totalizing efficiency that Germany had claimed as its unique virtue. "How long have you been producing this?" Bowler asked. Patterson shrugged. "Mass production? Since 43, I think. Maybe earlier. It's hard to keep track. They're always ramping up something." Since 1943, while German soldiers died of infections that could have been prevented, while German doctors learned to accept loss as inevitable, American factories had been running day and night, transforming mold into medicine, ensuring that no Allied soldier would suffer for want of treatment. The asymmetry was staggering. Historical records from captured German medical officers reveal a consistent pattern of disbelief. Reports filed by Wehrmacht physicians who became prisoners of war frequently mention the incomprehensible abundance of Allied medical supplies. One document, recovered from Wehrmacht archives in Freiburg, describes an incident in Tunisia where a German medical company surrendered with their supplies exhausted. The American unit that captured them possessed more morphine in their battalion aid station than the entire German division had seen in 6 months. Dr. Bowler's experience was not unique. It was universal. Across every theater of war, German medical personnel confronted the same impossible reality. Their enemy possessed not merely superior medicine, but superior everything, superior logistics, superior supply chains, superior industrial coordination. The Americans did not win through courage or sacrifice, though they possessed both. They won through production, through an economic system that could simultaneously field armies, supply allies, maintain civilian prosperity, and still generate surplus enough to treat enemy wounded with the same medicines they gave their own men. This last detail, the willingness to use scarce resources on prisoners, struck Böhler with particular force. In Wehrmacht field hospitals, captured Allied soldiers received treatment only after German wounded had been addressed. It was policy, grounded in the rational allocation of limited supplies. But here, in the American aid station, a German private with an infected wound received the same dosage of penicillin as an American sergeant. The medicine was distributed based on medical need, not nationality. When Böhler asked Keller about this, the American captain seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. "They're wounded," Keller said simply. "We're doctors. What else would we do?" The ideological implications took longer to process. Dr. Böhler had been raised in a Germany that defined itself through struggle, through the Darwinian competition of nations where only the strong survived. National Socialism had taught him that scarcity was natural, that the world's resources were finite, that nations must fight for their share or perish. This philosophy extended to medicine. The strong deserved treatment, the weak, the expendable, the racially inferior, they could be allowed to die. It was not cruelty, it was efficiency, it was nature. But American abundance suggested a different philosophy entirely. Here was a nation that produced enough medicine to treat not only its own citizens, not only its soldiers, but enemy combatants as well. Here was a system that did not accept scarcity as inevitable, but met it with overwhelming production. The Americans did not ration penicillin because they did not need to. They had solved the problem not through discipline or sacrifice, but through industry and innovation. This realization carried a weight that no military defeat could match. Germany had lost battles before, but this was different. This was the revelation that the entire ideological foundation of the Reich, its emphasis on hierarchy, on struggle, on the cruel necessities of survival, had been rendered obsolete by a nation that simply made more of everything. One afternoon, Böhler found himself watching an American medic treat a young Waffen SS soldier who had been brought in with a chest wound. The boy was perhaps 17, still wore the lightning bolt insignia of Himmler's elite. He had been indoctrinated from childhood, taught that he represented the pinnacle of racial purity, the sword arm of a 1,000-year Reich. Now he lay on an American stretcher, receiving American medicine, saved by men he had been trained to see as racially mongrelized and weak. A medic, a corporal from Georgia with a slow drawl and gentle hands, injected penicillin, checked the boy's pulse, adjusted his plasma drip. He did not lecture, did not condemn, simply treated the wound with the detached professionalism of a mechanic repairing an engine. Böhler realized, watching this, that ideology had not saved the boy. Racial purity had not saved him. Discipline and sacrifice had not saved him. What had saved him was a yellow powder, mass-produced in a Brooklyn warehouse, distributed with industrial efficiency, administered without judgment. The American medic finished his work and moved to the next patient. The boy would live. The Reich he had served would not. By June, the war in Europe was over. Dr. Böhler remained with the American Medical Unit as a voluntary assistant, working alongside former enemies to treat the tide of displaced persons, liberated prisoners, and shattered civilians that flooded the aid stations. He learned to use penicillin with the confidence of abundance, no longer measuring doses with the precision of a miser counting coins. The American supply trucks arrived like clockwork. Medicine, food, bandages, plasma, coffee, chocolate. Items both essential and trivial, delivered with the same unfailing regularity. Böhler asked Captain Keller once where it all came from, how the logistics functioned, how a nation could sustain such abundance while fighting wars on 2 continents. Keller pulled out a worn map and traced supply lines with his finger. "Starts here," he said, pointing to the east coast of America. Factories in New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio. Medicine gets loaded onto Liberty ships. We're building them faster than the Germans can sink them. Crosses the Atlantic to England. Gets sorted, repackaged, loaded onto trucks and planes. Flows to depots, then to field hospitals, then to us. The whole system runs like a train schedule. As long as the factories keep producing, we keep getting supplied. And if the factories stop, Keller smiled. They won't. That's the thing. Back home, civilians are making more stuff than they know what to do with. Cars, radios, refrigerators. We converted it all to war production. But the capacity doesn't go away. When this is over, they'll just go back to making civilian goods. The machine keeps running. The machine keeps running. Those words echoed in Böhler's mind long after the conversation ended. Germany had mobilized for total war, had extracted every ounce of production from its economy, had worked its people to exhaustion and beyond, and still it had not been enough. Because the American machine was larger, more efficient, fed by resources and industrial capacity that Germany could not match. The yellow powder became, in Böhler's mind, the symbol of this disparity. Each vial represented the gap between aspiration and capability, between what the Reich claimed to be and what America simply was. Hitler had promised a 1,000-year empire built on strength and will. Roosevelt had delivered a war machine built on production and logistics. One was myth. The other was measurable in tonnage. In July 1945, Dr. Heinrich Böhler was transferred to a displaced persons camp near Munich, where he continued to work under American supervision. The camp held thousands, former prisoners, refugees, German soldiers awaiting processing. Disease spread quickly in such conditions. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. In the old world, such a camp would have been a death trap, a place where people died not from malice, but from the simple arithmetic of insufficient medicine. But the Americans brought penicillin, brought sulfa drugs, brought vaccines and antiseptics and a logistical network that ensured the camp hospital remained supplied even as the patient population swelled. Böhler worked 14-hour days, treating infections that would have been fatal in 1942, watching recovery rates that would have seemed impossible in the Wehrmacht Medical Corps. He kept a journal during this period, entries written in cramped German script. One passage, dated August 3, 1945, reads, "Today I treated 42 patients with bacterial infections. 42. Used 120 units of penicillin. The supply clerk asked if I needed more. Asked as though it were nothing. as though medicine grew on trees. Perhaps in America it does. Another entry, undated but filed in early September, contains a longer reflection. I have begun to understand that we did not lose the war in 1945. We lost it in 1941, perhaps earlier, the moment we chose to fight a nation that could transform mold into medicine faster than we could train soldiers. They did not defeat us with courage, though they had it. They did not defeat us with sacrifice, though they gave it. They defeated us with factories, with production lines, with a philosophy that saw abundance not as impossible luxury, but as achievable goal. We built an empire on scarcity. They built a democracy on surplus. History will judge which proved stronger. The broader story of penicillin in World War II extends far beyond Dr. Burler's experience, though his journey captures its essential truth. Between 1943 and 1945, American and British factories produced approximately 1.633 billion units of penicillin. This figure, almost incomprehensible in its scale, represented the largest coordinated pharmaceutical effort in human history. It saved an estimated 12 to 15% of all Allied soldiers who would have otherwise died from infected wounds. Tens of thousands of lives preserved by industrial chemistry. The development of mass production techniques required unprecedented cooperation between government and private industry. The U.S. War Production Board coordinated efforts across 19 pharmaceutical companies, sharing research, standardizing procedures, pooling resources. What began as a British discovery, Fleming's 1929 observation of antibacterial mold, became an American industrial triumph through the application of deep tank fermentation technology, a process pioneered by the dairy industry and adapted for antibiotic production. German intelligence was aware of these developments. Wehrmacht reports from 1943 mention Allied use of penicillin, note its effectiveness, recommend efforts to capture supplies or develop domestic production. But German pharmaceutical industry, hampered by Allied bombing, resource shortages, and the fragmentation of research under competing Nazi agencies, never achieved meaningful production. By war's end, German penicillin output measured in grams, while American output measured in tons. This disparity extended across every category of supply. The United States produced more ammunition, more vehicles, more ships, more aircraft, more food, more medicine than any nation in history. American industrial output in 1944 exceeded the combined production of Germany, Japan, and Italy. It was not a close competition. It was an avalanche of material superiority that buried Axis forces beneath a weight of steel and chemistry. Dr. Böhler remained in Germany after the war, working first in displaced persons camps, then in civilian hospitals as the occupation gave way to reconstruction. He never returned to private practice. The experience of those months in 1945, the confrontation with American medical abundance, had changed something fundamental in his understanding of medicine's purpose. In 1947, he published a paper in a German medical journal titled Observations on Allied Medical Practices During the Occupation. The paper was clinical, factual, stripped of political commentary. But between its careful descriptions of treatment protocols and supply logistics ran a current of quiet revelation. Böhler documented not just what the Americans had done, but what they had proven possible. Medicine, he argued, need not be a scarce resource distributed by triage and necessity. Given sufficient industrial capacity and political will, it could be made abundant enough to treat all who needed it. The paper attracted little attention at the time. Germany, in 1947, had more pressing concerns than medical philosophy. But in later years, as the Federal Republic built its social welfare system, as universal health care became a cornerstone of post-war European democracy, Bowler's observations found new relevance. The lesson of American penicillin was not merely technical. It was ideological. It suggested that abundance, not scarcity, should be the baseline assumption of modern civilization. In archives across Europe and America, documents from the war years tell this story in fragments. Requisition forms showing penicillin shipments, medical reports detailing infection rates before and after antibiotic treatment, photographs of factory workers tending fermentation tanks, letters from soldiers describing wounds that healed, infections that vanished, lives that continued. One photograph, held in the National Archives in Washington, shows a medical supply depot in France, June 1944. Wooden crates stacked 10 feet high, each stenciled with the word penicillin and a serial number. In the foreground, an American medic sits on a crate, reading a letter from home. Behind him, the crates stretch into shadow, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, each containing enough medicine to save dozens of lives. The image is mundane. The medic is not posed heroically. The crates are not arranged artistically. It is simply a record of logistics, of supply meeting demand, of a system functioning as designed. Yet in its very ordinariness lies something profound. This was not a special shipment. This was not emergency supply. This was routine. This was normal. This was what abundance looked like. Heinrich Bowler died in 1982 at the age of 76 in a hospital in Stuttgart. He had spent the post-war decades as an advocate for universal health care, for medical systems built on the principle that treatment should be determined by need rather than ability to pay. His colleagues remembered him as quiet, methodical, a man who spoke rarely, but with precision when he did. In his personal papers, donated to the German Medical History Museum after his death, researchers found a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, was a single glass vial, empty. The label, faded but still legible, read, Penicillin G sodium, 100,000 units, Pfizer, 1945. A note, in Bowler's handwriting, accompanied the vial. The first dose I ever administered, May 1945. An American captain gave me an entire crate. I could not believe such generosity was possible, or that medicine could exist in such quantity. I kept this vial as reminder, not of defeat, but of what becomes possible when a society chooses abundance over scarcity, when it builds systems to serve life rather than enforce hierarchy. We lost more than a war in 19... The yellow powder, mass-produced and mundane, became the symbol through which one German doctor understood the collapse of everything he had been taught to believe. Not through propaganda, not through occupation, but through the simple, undeniable fact that his enemy possessed enough medicine to treat every soldier, including those who had fought against them. In the arithmetic of war, abundance defeated scarcity. In the philosophy of nations, democracy outproduced totalitarianism. In the story of one doctor's transformation, a glass vial of antibiotic became the lens through which the entire conflict came into focus. The penicillin did not merely heal wounds, it exposed the fundamental weakness at the heart of Nazi ideology, the belief that strength came from discipline and sacrifice rather than productivity and cooperation. It demonstrated that the future belonged not to those who could endure scarcity most stoically, but to those who could eliminate it most completely. Dr. Böhler learned this lesson in a monastery in Bavaria, surrounded by wounded men and wooden crates stamped with English words. He learned it in the casual efficiency of American medics, who never counted vials because they never needed to. He learned it in the answer to a question he had never thought to ask. What happens when medicine becomes abundant enough that no one needs to be sacrificed? The answer, delivered in yellow powder and measured in billions of units, was that the world changes, not through rhetoric or ideology, but through the simple, revolutionary act of making enough. Evening settles over the converted monastery. The last surgical case has been completed. In the ward, men sleep, German and American both, sorted by injury rather than allegiance. Outside, the generators hum their steady rhythm, keeping lights burning through the darkness. Dr. Böhler stands at the supply cabinet, counting inventory for tomorrow's work. Penicillin, morphine, sulfa drugs, plasma, bandages, coffee, chocolate, all present, all sufficient, all ordinary in their abundance. He thinks of the lessons learned in scarcity, the choices he made when medicine ran dry, the men he could not save because the arithmetic demanded sacrifice. He thinks of the ideology that told him such choices were inevitable, that scarcity was the natural state of the world, that only the strong deserved to survive. And he thinks of the wooden crates that arrive each week like clockwork, like certainty, carrying enough medicine to treat every patient who needs it. Perhaps this, he thinks, is what democracy looks like. Not speeches or elections or political theory. Simply this: enough medicine for everyone. Enough food for everyone. The radical proposition that abundance is achievable, and that achieving it is worth the effort. The yellow powder sits on the shelf, mundane and miraculous, awaiting tomorrow's wounded. In its crystalline structure, in the industrial processes that created it, in the supply chains that delivered it across oceans and continents, lives a truth more powerful than any propaganda: that the nations who build systems of abundance will inherit the future from those who worship scarcity. Dr. Böhler closes the cabinet. Tomorrow there will be more wounded. Tomorrow the crates will arrive again. Tomorrow the machine will keep running, because that is what machines built on abundance do. They run, they produce, they save lives, not because ideology demands it, but because capacity allows it. And in the end, capacity proved to be the only ideology that mattered.